Hey everybody, welcome to Proverbs on the Patio, a chapter by chapter study through the book of Proverbs. Going to take us about 31 weeks, and we are jumping into chapter 17 in just a second. For those of you who are part of our church, I just want to say things are going really well right now. We continue to have larger and larger crowds outside, socially distanced, under our event tent on the church property at 9:30 on Sundays. And this past Sunday, man, we had church. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was raining, but people were singing, people were clapping, people were laughing. Like, it was the best interaction we've had as a church really since March when everything shut down. So I want to say thank you guys for being flexible. Thank you for adjusting to the issues of the day, the challenges of the moment. And I know some people were cold on Sunday, so as I said, I'm going to layer up this week, and from now on I'm just going to layer up every week. I can always take a jacket off, right, or a scarf off, but it was only 63 degrees, and it's amazing how cold we all felt. But God has been good to our church right now, so we're grateful for that. And those of you who've been joining us online, we continue to stream at 8 o'clock, 9:30, and 11 a.m. on Sundays. So guys, the church is doing well. Let's jump into chapter 17 of the book of Proverbs. Right away, we're going to deal with an idea of minimalism. Well, I say that. I want to kind of push back on that, but read with me verse 1. Better is a dry morsel with a quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. There's a couple of things going on here. Obviously, we know there has a few better than verses already, and we know it's better to have a little than to have a lot with a lot of trouble. That's kind of an idea that's been framed already, but in this case, there's a religious aspect. So it says, then a house full of feasting. Often the Hebrews would only feast when there was a religious celebration going on or a festival honoring how God had provided for them. So there was a religious component here. And what he's saying is, hey, better to have a little bit of food but have no strife, and the idea is here no sin, right, than to have all of the feasting that goes along with being religious but actually not live it out in your private life. So there's the idea of not being a hypocrite. This is an idea that Jesus really expounds upon in the New Testament, talking about don't just tell people you don't do these things. It's one thing not to commit adultery, it's another thing not to lust. It's the idea of actually living out what we say we're living out. So he's saying, don't be a feaster who's always having strife. And the idea is be a religious, outgoing, telling everybody you love Jesus, you got the name of Christ, but don't actually back it up. And then there's the other idea here. A dry morsel is not a great feast, so it's less than minimalism. And Jesus, right, he didn't have a home, a place to lay his head. He often depended on others to provide for him. So it's saying here, better is a dry morsel. So some can take this verse and say we should embrace minimalism. And I always want to push back. I think we should. Minimalism is a good thing to embrace when we live in a culture that embraces consumerism, but at the same time, minimalism can become its own gospel. We can believe, well, if I just have less stuff, I'll be more happy. No, it's the idea of not placing our happiness in stuff or in the lack of stuff. It's my joy comes from my relationship with God. And so I don't need stuff, but I also don't need to prove that I can have less stuff. It's not allowing stuff, the absence of stuff or the presence of stuff, to dictate my joy. So in this case, regardless of feasting or dry morsel, it's the idea of having no strife, having no internal strife, no relational strife. So don't just say, well, I need to be a minimalist. Christians should not be consumers. We should not be consumed by stuff like culture is. But at the same time, we shouldn't just say, well, if I'm a minimalist, I've got it all together. Jesus' minimalism wasn't the gospel. His minimalism was born out of a right view of stuff. And if you're depending on stuff or feasting or always having the best or latest new thing or being invited to parties to give you happiness, the idea here is no, a dry morsel can actually do that. So don't be a hypocrite. And then he goes on to say in verse 5, whoever mocks the poor insults his maker, the creator, God himself. There's two thoughts here. We mock God when we mock the poor. And this is any view of the poor that dismisses them, that tries to make them less than, that says, well, they deserve that, or that's just their lot in life, or says they've somehow they've brought this upon themselves. And surely we all do things that have consequences. But anytime we try to categorize the poor, and really we look into caste systems around the world, or class systems as they existed in times gone by in history, or using someone's income, and this is true of all things, race, like we don't use any of these buckets to put people in and say, I'm better or they're worse than me because of that. So don't mock the poor. He says when you do this, you insult the maker. A couple things. Number one, you might insult the maker by assuming that God somehow designed them to be poor. God he doesn't care, or he has sovereignly willed them to just be poor. And the idea here is, no, that's not how this works. There are all kinds of situations that we don't have control over, or that someone may not have control over. There are certainly cases in our life where we do things that lead to poverty, but there are also injustices in the world. So you can't just say, well, the poor just deserve. Well, there are certainly poor people in our country and around the world who are fighting unjust systems around them, whether they be political systems, whether they be cultural systems. Like, there are all kinds of pressures that we don't always see. And so we don't just assume that was God's will. We don't just say, well, it's God's will for you to be poor. It's God's will for you to be sick. It's God's will. No, we say that, he says here, that insults the maker. Number two, the second way it insults the maker is when you mock the poor, you are mocking the very people that Jesus identified with. Now, think about this. When Jesus talked about his return in Matthew chapter 25, he said, you will know that you have done right. And he says, and they said, how will we know, Lord? And he says, you will receive a reward for when you treated me, how you treated the poor. You will treat me as you've treated the least of these. And so he says, I will reward you for how you treat the poor, when you visit those in prison, when you care for the widow, the orphan, the sick. Like, Jesus lays it out, and he's like, as you treat the least of these, you treat me. So when we mock the poor, we're actually mocking who Jesus says he identifies with, and really who he spent most of his time with. Jesus did not spend most of his time with the rich. He certainly had a relationship with Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man. I think of some of the temple leaders. In John chapter 3, he met, well, I can't remember his name. You guys put it in the comments, and it is just escaping me. John chapter 3, where he famously quotes, we have the quote, John 3:16, God so loved the world. He was Nicodemus. He meets with Nicodemus, a wealthy, powerful man. But more often than not, Jesus was surrounded by the poor, the sick, the sinners of the culture. So when we mock the poor, we insult God. Second part of the verse. And he who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. So you say, Pastor Mark, I've got a right view of the poor. I understand that there are marginalized and unjust, and okay. But when we're glad at calamity, when we love for other people to have a hard time, whether it's because we don't like them or we just enjoy watching other people suffer, he says when we're glad in calamity, we will not go unpunished. This is serious. We ought not to take pleasure in the pain of others. All are created in God's image. So hear me. The people you like, the people you don't like, the people you dismiss, the people you hate, God created them. He loves them. And so when there is trouble, when there is pain, we should not take joy in that. And hear me, we shouldn't even take joy in the idea that people will be punished for sin. We should never take joy in the punishment of humans. Whether it's by somebody else or by God himself, we should never take joy in that. So then he goes on to say in verse 6, and this is a whole different idea that I want to jump into that's beautiful. He begins to reframe how we look at the family. As a believer, we know that the Proverbs are not promises. They're Proverbs of if we begin following God, this is usually what will happen. And so when we come into faith, we have a new relationship with the family. We believe the family was created by God, and it doesn't have to be disruptive. It doesn't have to be dysfunctional. It can be a beautiful thing inside of culture, inside of the world as God created it to be. And so he says in verse 6, grandchildren are the crown of the aged. Now, we don't have to look far to see grandkids who are shame to their grandparents. You don't have to look far to find grandparents who are disappointed in their grandkids. But when we follow God and we have a healthy relationship with the Lord and things go as we hope they do, like our grandkids can actually be a crown of the age. And then he says, and the glory of children is their fathers. Look around in culture and we know this isn't always the case. More often than not, fathers are not just not present, but if they are present, they're a disappointment to their kids. They aren't relationally connecting with them. They aren't engaging with their kids. They aren't modeling good behavior. As a matter of fact, a lot of times the sins of the father are passed down to the son because, man, we continue to do the same things that our dad did, that our grandfather did. And he says the glory of children is their fathers. This is our vision for the family. If you are a part of our church, we don't just want you to go to church and feel better, just get saved so you can get to heaven one day and we'll just muddle on through this life. No, we want you to have this kind of a family where your grandkids, if generation comes after generation, your grandkids are the pride of your life. They're the crown of the age. They are something that is encouraging to you, and you are proud of them. And we want kids to have a relationship with their dads where they are the glory of the children. They're honored by their father, and they honor their father. This is what we strive for, and this doesn't just happen. Broken people, sinners, don't just make these things happen. It has to take years of following the Lord, making right decisions, confession, repentance. Man, it takes time and effort, but this can be the beauty of the family unit. Guys, I believe this is true. I want this for your family. And this proverb says, man, we do these things. If you begin reading through the Proverbs and living out the Proverbs over and over, these things should come to bear. In verse 14, he flips the page again. A lot of little good nuggets here. The beginning of strife is like letting out water. It's like a little leak. A couple of weeks ago, I had to go to one of my rental properties to deal with a leak. And it's an old rental property, built in like the 50s, I think. And so we opened up the wall underneath the sink, and sure enough, the drain pipe, you could just tell, had a big leak. Every time you turned on the faucet or the dishwasher drain, tons of water started coming out. That leak probably started pretty small, but it turned into basically a waterfall. And over time, man, it eroded the wood. So like that leak over time just destroyed the drywall, the wood. You notice this verse, the beginning of strife is like letting out water. Once it starts, it's hard to stop it. So the idea here is, hey, stop it before it starts. So the second part of the verse, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. Don't let it get worse. This is why we should be peacemakers on the front end. It is hard to make peace once all-out war has started. It is hard to make peace once feelings are hurt. It is hard to make peace once you've said what you regret. Hey, Maya, say hello to everybody. She's tired of being out here with me. So he says, don't let this thing go untouched and undealt with. Like, deal with it quickly. Guys, we're to be peacemakers. Paul even says, don't get into quarrelsome arguments, divisive conversations that lead to, they just lead to hurt feelings, and they break up the unity of the church. And this is why we're so careful in our small groups. We're not afraid to talk about topics where the Bible talks about them. But at the same time, if somebody comes into one of our small groups and they just want to talk politics and get people fighting, that's the type of person that we pull to the side and say, hey, that's not what this is about. We're here to have unity in the faith and unity in the body. And certainly there are all kinds of ways that our faith informs maybe how we vote or how we engage in politics. But we don't just argue for arguing's sake. We want to be peacemakers, as Jesus called us to be. And that's not to say we don't talk about divisive topics. That's to say we understand what it means to be a people who avoid quarrels that are unnecessary. And I heard somebody say, or I saw a quote on Facebook or Twitter or something, there's a lot of people who get really mad when you don't want to fight about the things they find important. And guys, that's the world right now. Everybody wants you to fight about every little thing. And we should be not just peacemakers, we should be wise enough to know what are things worth quarreling over, what are things worth arguing about, and there's not many, and what are the things that I can look the other way and say, man, I don't agree with you, but I'm not going to get into it with you because my relationship with you is too important for us to get in a fight over this or that. Then he goes on to say in verse 22, and I've only got 2 left, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. This is hundreds of years before we realize all of the implications of mental health. But the writer here knows there's more to our health than just our bones, our muscles, our heart, our lungs. Our spirit, our mental health matters. He says, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. You can get sick from within, from a broken heart, from a crushed spirit. So this is why we encourage you, man, don't just run, don't just lose weight. We believe in spiritual health, mental, emotional health. And for there to be health, there has to be exercise, right? Like you think about going to the gym, building your muscles. Some of us need to take some spiritual get into some spiritual rhythms of exercise, reading the Bible, praying and fasting. Emotional health requires some tough conversations. And a lot of us, the reasons we don't have emotional health is because we don't have the conversations with ourselves first or with others or even with the Lord. So finding emotional, spiritual health, right? Whether it's dealing with sin in our own heart or hurt that someone else has dealt us, helps us have health, not just to spiritually, emotionally, but it bleeds over into the physical. Maya's saying it's time to wrap up. Verse 27 is the last one that I had highlighted here. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge. We've heard a play on this a couple of times. And he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. We kind of get this flip. We say, well, if I want understanding, I'll just have a cool spirit. Kind of reverse. When you have understanding, you will have a cool spirit. When you have knowledge, you will restrain your words. The very next verse, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. So if you don't have it, you can at least pretend to be wise by not running your mouth. But the wiser we get, the more often than not, we're the cool, calm presence in the room. And that's what our churches need. That is what our groups need. That's what your work environment needs. That's what your family needs. That's what our culture needs. We don't need more loud talking heads. We need people who restrain their words because they have knowledge and we need people who have a cool spirit. Maya says we are done. So guys, enjoyed Proverbs chapter 17 tonight. Hope you enjoy chapter 18. Read up on it. Get ahead. We'll be there next week, and I look forward to seeing you under the tent this week at 9:30 or online at 8, 9:30, and 11 a.m. You guys have a blessed Wednesday night.